There is one painting fundamental. Well, it's actually not a fundamental, but I believe it's just too important for me not to talk about. So, this is a fundamental part of my process, and this is something I think about all the time whenever I'm painting anything in 3D. So, I'm gonna walk you through this, and also, I'm sorry if I get too rambly. This is a bit of a tricky thing to explain. So, I'm just gonna try to intuitively try to convey the mindset that I have, and that's hopefully going to make sense somehow. So this thing, this fundamental, this secret thing that I'm talking about is being able to create form, being able to make things go from 2D from looking flat to look 3D and have actual depth. So let's imagine you have a sphere. You have a sphere that's flat, that doesn't have any depth. How do you make it look 3D? How do you render this? That is, in my opinion, the most important thing, even though it's not a formal fundamental. It is the most important thing you can learn for painting, because this will allow you to create form from imagination and just being able to create depth in general, so your paintings don't look flat. Because from my experience, the most prevalent mistake that I've done in the past, and what I've seen a lot of beginner artists, a lot of my students do, a very common mistake is just making things very flat and not having any sense of depth in the individual planes or areas where there should be depth. So the way you render this sphere is the same way that you render a face, for example. So the reason why I'm bringing up the spheres here is because it kind of correlates. Like, the process of making this sphere look 3D is the same process of making a face look 3D, or any other 3D object, like an arm or a hand, whatever you're painting. It really doesn't matter. But I'm bringing up the spheres because of course, painting a sphere is way easier than painting a face, because, it's more straightforward. So the point that I want to make is that when you're painting a face, or at least when I'm painting a face, this is the kind of mindset that the way I approach painting automatically, just intuitively, without really thinking about it. I will approach each area of the face individually. The reason why I think spheres are so important, and I'm always telling you to learn to paint spheres, is because, let's say I'm painting a face. Each individual area or plane of the face, I'm going to render that area individually, okay? When I'm rendering, when I want to add depth to that area. So there are two stages or two steps in the process that I have. The first stage is to make kind of like the sketch, or make the flat shape on the first place, which is the equivalent of just making a very rough sphere without any form. And I'm making this just for the sake of knowing where I'm going to render things, okay? So if you compare all of my process to painting a sphere, it automatically starts to make sense. Once I have the flat color and I know where I'm going to render each area, I can treat each of these individual areas as spheres. So I'm going to render these areas the same way that I'm going to render a sphere, which is just basically adding depth. And the mentality that I have is kind of like adding highlights. Just keep adding highlights to these areas, because the highlights will kind of guide you. They will tell you where things reflect in that plane, in that metaphorical sphere that you're painting. Okay, so far I don't know if I'm making sense, so I'm just gonna elaborate a little bit further on this point. So just to reiterate, to make things very clear, each plane of the face, each individual part, like the forehead, the cheekbones, the nose, the chin, all of these individual areas, I render them individually. What is rendering? Rendering is going from this very flat stage. So remember the flat looking sphere is from going from this very flat stage to a very render stage, to making this metaphorical sphere have depth and form. This is rendering. It's just giving form to a flat shape. And hopefully this will help someone, because this has helped me a lot, to kind of reframe the way that I paint. Sometimes when I'm not feeling in the mood for painting, or I'm feeling my rendering is feeling kind of off, and I'm feeling a bit in a weird tempo, I have to remember that you render these things individually. It's not like you're going to render the whole face at once. So you go by areas. You first render the nose, you first render the forehead, and then you go to like the other areas like the chin, the cheekbones, whatever, because these areas reflect light individually. So in my mind, it's like I have, for me, a face is just a bunch of spheres that I have to paint individually. It's like a bunch of little paintings, if that makes sense. So if you have a bunch of spheres that you have to paint in a single canvas, you're not gonna paint them all at once. You're just gonna paint one by one individually. So this is exactly what it's like to paint another thing, to paint a face or to paint something. And I'm bringing up a face so much because it naturally has very complicated planes, and you know, it's very complicated by nature. So it's also the thing that I like to paint the most. So it just applies perfectly for what I'm talking about right now. So it is important that you learn how to render spheres, because if you know how to render a sphere, you know how to render everything else. Basically, I always give the comparison, I always make like the extrapolation with a nose, because a sphere is very similar to a nose in the way that it's shaped. So it makes sense, if you're struggling to paint a nose, you should focus on getting better at painting spheres, and you will naturally get better at painting noses, because it is the same way in the sense that it reflects light in a similar way. You know, it's all about the way that these surfaces reflect light. Of course, each surface is going to have a different texture and is going to reflect light in a different way. So it's not the same painting a ball of clay or a sphere with a clay texture or a skin texture than, you know, a metal sphere, or, you know, trying to render like a metal surface is going to be a complete different thing. And also, one of the requisites to be good at rendering is being good at blending, at making smooth value transitions with your brush that follow the direction of the object that you're painting. Because if it doesn't follow the direction of the object that you're painting, it's going to look really weird and it's not going to look very realistic. Another thing I also like to do is, whenever I'm painting faces, I like to exaggerate the highlights. I genuinely think exaggerating the highlights is a good habit, as kind of silly as it sounds, because, you know, it's a bit of a stylization thing. It's like you're exaggerating a bit the form of these planes in this case. If, you know, I like exaggerating kind of like the highlights on the nose, or like the cheekbones, or like the chin, you know, this type of areas, just a little bit, because you're emphasizing on the form, and this will help you to kind of force you to have a smoother transition when you are painting these highlights. And again, even though this is not like an actual fundamental, this is something you should pay attention to, really, especially if you are a beginner artist. I bet you are really struggling on this specifically, because that's what I was struggling with. I was struggling to make things kind of pop, to make things look 3D and have some actual form. And of course, there are some other ways of creating depth without necessarily having to do any rendering, like using the planes of the face. You know, if you only paint like the planes, you can still make things look very 3D and geometrical, so to speak, without having to do any blending. So I guess this isn't really set in stone. You know, you should always take this type of videos with a grain of salt, because everything that I say, every advice that I can give you or any other artist will give you, can always have an exception. I can say, oh yeah, this is the rule and this is what's gonna look good and you shouldn't do otherwise. But you can do otherwise and you can make something, you know, look really good as well. So it's kind of like, you know, just do what works for you. Take from this video what you feel like it's useful. This is just what I find myself naturally doing when I paint. So I'm just giving you a bit of my contribution so you can make your own ideas out of all of this. Also, guys, I just want to take some time to talk about my new painting course that I just released. When I was a beginner, my art was really trash. It was really terrible. I wanted to improve. I was actually grinding, but I didn't know in what direction to go. I didn't know the way. I didn't know the straightforward steps to get to the point that I wanted. And so after many years of learning art, I actually finally figured it out. So I'm teaching it to you here in this course. If you feel like you are stuck in this stage like I was, this complete guide that I made focuses on getting you out of this beginner rut. I genuinely feel this is a game changer. So if you feel like my free content has already helped you improving your art and you want to check out my bonus content, you can find it in the first link in the description. So thank you for watching. See you in the next video.